Hey.
Welcome to Ratio Christi at Marshall University. This is our live Facebook feed on Thursday evenings. This is our actual meeting. This week we have a special guest, our friend, believe it or not. He is our friend, Adam Hamby, professing Buddhist, and he's going to present on Buddhism and Christianity, the morality, comparing the two, or something to that effect. I'm not sure. He might change his mind.
Yeah,
But
that's good enough.
With that being said,
Okay, like John said, I'm here to compare these two different moral philosophies, and the reason I like comparing them is because in some ways they're polar opposite. I find that fascinating, right? Because we've all been kind of brought up with this Christian view of morality, this Christian way of thinking, and this essentially it's all throughout our culture, right? It seeps into every form of it, and so I was a Christian for most of my life. And then when I left Christianity and discovered Buddhism, I was surprised at how different it was. I mean, just almost the polar opposite in a lot of ways. It was fascinating to me. And it was contrary to everything I had learned, everything I grew up with. So that's why I think this kind of discussion, I'll be having a debate on October 21st. It'll be the Secular Student Alliance and Ratio Christi hosting the debate. So this is really just kind of a primer for the kinds of things that I'm going to be talking about in the debate in October. So in comparing the worldviews, the first thing I think we have to start with is people, the way that Christianity and Buddhism views people. In Christianity, the origin of sin begins in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were told not to eat the apple of knowledge of good and evil, but a talking snake convinced them to do it, and thus, according to the Bible, they suffered a spiritual death and sin entered into the world. Christianity views people as inherently evil, sinful, depraved, or broken. Some Christians are uncomfortable with these terms, but the gist of the meaning is still there. In other words, people are born with something wrong with them, but they can never fix it in this lifetime, and that's their sinful nature. And this is a quote from the Bible, Romans 7:14 through 20. This is Paul. He says, "We know the law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate to do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is the sin living within me. For I know that good itself does not dwell within me, that is in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now if I do what I want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is the sin living in me that does it." Clearly there is a conflict in Paul. He does not understand himself. He has the desire to do good, but he has this sinful nature which constantly interferes with his virtuous desire. The message of Christianity is not that accepting Christ will take away your sinful desire or behavior. It may reduce it, but the true gift of Christ is the freedom from sin. It doesn't happen until the next life. In Buddhism, people are born good, but we're born into a bondage of delusion and suffering. It is a result of suffering that people make bad or sinful choices that harm themselves and others. In Buddhism, suffering is a part of the nature of reality, and the entire purpose and meaning behind Buddhism is to understand the cause of this suffering so that the practitioner can find inner peace. To understand the Buddhist take on sin as it relates to morality, present an old Cherokee legend called The Tale of Two Wolves. One evening, an old Cherokee told his grandson about a battle that goes on inside people. He said, "My son, there is a battle between two wolves inside us all. One is evil. It is anger, envy, jealousy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. The other is good. It is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith." The grandson thought about this for a minute and then asked his grandfather, "Which wolf wins?" And the old Cherokee quietly replied, "The one you feed." In Buddhism, it is not simply a matter of a sinful nature we were born with and stuck with because of the actions of two people a long time ago, but there is a process which allows us to understand the nature of suffering and overcome it. On a Buddhist view, if suffering and delusion is the cause of sin, then by coming to a deeper understanding of ourselves and our own minds, we can address the root cause of our misery and find inner peace. Now, to support this view, right, that suffering causes sin, because, again, in Christianity, it's just, we're born sinful, that's the reason we do it. There's not really a great explanation, it's just who we are. But The Buddhist view is that there is a reason for sin. There is a reason we do bad things, and that's because we suffer. So you can clearly see this in your own life. You can see how you're suffering, how suffering causes people to do things which they later regret or which they don't understand. So for example, if you may love someone and you may be very close to them, but if you get into an argument with someone and you're very angry at them, in that moment when you are suffering the most, then you will say something very hurtful to them. And why do you say something to them that is extremely hurtful? Because you want them to understand how you feel. Even though what you said is really wrong and it hurts them, you say it because you're suffering and you want them to feel your suffering, right? Or when we are feeling very down or depressed or having a very bad day and we overeat, we are suffering, right? We know that gluttony is bad. We know that we shouldn't eat these things, but we're in pain. And the food is a way to help us cope with the suffering. We can see this clearly in Huntington. There's a lot of suffering in Huntington. The heroin epidemic is worse in Huntington than it is anywhere else in the U.S. And why is that the case? Well, I believe personally that these people are suffering. I don't think anyone would inject themselves with this drug that ruins your life and takes all your money and just makes you into just this addicted person if there was not something in your life that was causing you to struggle. So to me, the fact that we live in Huntington is we are kind of like a great example of how suffering can alter society and alter the behavior of people. I wouldn't say it's sin. I don't think, it's sin, that's the reason they're injecting themselves with heroin. No, I mean, obviously there's suffering. Obviously there's something going on in their lives. I lost a very good friend less than a year ago to a heroin overdose. And it's very sad. And also, we can look statistically and socially at the relationship between suffering and crime. There is a direct statistical link between poverty and crime. What does poverty mean? Poverty means that if you don't have the resources that you need to survive, you don't have the food, the education, the materials you need to survive and thrive as a person, obviously you're going to suffer more. This increase in suffering leads to a higher crime rates in ghettos and places, not just in the U.S., throughout the world, where people's basic needs are not being met. It is completely obvious. I mean, what I'm saying is, this is not just a theory. You can test it in your life. You can see how suffering causes you to hurt other people and to do things that you later regret, and you can also see how society is shaped by suffering. Now, it's important to note that within Buddhism, terms like broken, sinful, depraved, etc. do not exist and are not applied to people. Because within Buddhism, people are not broken, they are afflicted with suffering and seeking an escape. Therefore, Buddhism does not focus on punishment, judgment, and condemnation for mistakes and bad decisions, but forgiveness and understanding. This is the fundamental difference between viewing people as inherently good or inherently evil. In the Christian view, people are born deserving hell, and therefore God is being merciful to offer them salvation. In the Buddhist view, people are born deserving happiness, but must find their own path. Now that we understand the nature of humans in each view, we'll discuss what grounds morality in each view. In Christianity, God's nature acts as the foundation for morality. Whatever God commands and does is moral simply because it is part of God's nature, and God's nature is inherently good. God therefore acts as the standard of morality, being the personification of it. But there's a complicated philosophical problem here. If God's nature is the standard for morality, then we should simply be able to replicate his nature, act the same way that God does in the Bible, and bada bing, bada boom, we're as moral as we can possibly be. But everybody knows this isn't allowed. We're absolutely not allowed to commit acts of genocide or torture or any other number of countless things that God does in the Bible against people that wrong him. So it's clear that the God of the Bible, though supposedly being the standard of morality, operates under a different set of moral rules than we do. And here you have a contradiction. Okay, raise your hand if you've seen the movie Dragonheart. I asked people to watch it. I don't know if everyone got it.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's a really good movie. You should watch it. It's got Sean Connery and Dennis Quaid. It's great. So in this movie, there's this thing called the Old Code. And the Old Code, it's a knight's code. It says, a knight is sworn to valor. Did you watch the movie? No, okay. A knight is sworn to valor. His heart knows only virtue. His blade defends the helpless. His might upholds the weak. His word speaks only truth. His wrath undoes the wicked. So there's this old code, and the main character of the movie that Dennis Quaid plays is raising this prince to become a good king. And he teaches him this code. And he says, you must remember this code if you want to be a fair and just king. And when Ivan, who is the prince, becomes the king, he becomes an evil king, and he oppresses people, and he is unjust to his citizens. And so Dennis Quaid, the character playing Bowen, he approaches Ivan and says, what you're doing is wrong, what you're doing is horrible. He said, have you forgotten the code? Have you forgotten the old code that I've taught you? And Ivan says, the king is above the code. And Dennis Quaid, slams him on the ground and says, no one is above the code, right? And that's important, right? Because what is the point of having a moral code that applies to everyone if it doesn't apply to you, right? So God seems to be above the law, even though he's supposed to be the definition of the law. His nature is supposed to be the definition of the law. And I'll give some examples of the Bible, from Bible verses, where I'll show this. This is Hosea 13:16. The people of Samaria must bear their guilt because they have rebelled against their God. They will fall by the sword. Their little ones will be dashed to the ground. Their pregnant women ripped open. This is Exodus 21:20 through 21. When a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod so hard that the slave dies under his hand, he shall be punished. If, however, the slave survives for a day or two, he is not to be punished, since the slave is his own property. So we know that slavery is wrong, right, today, but according to God, right, slavery is okay. It's okay to beat your slaves just as long as you don't kill them. I mean, this is the biblical law in Exodus. Also, another interesting thing, child abuse. Who's heard the famous verse, Proverbs 13:24, spare the rod, spoil the child, okay? Well, we know now that that spanking, for example, beating your kid with a cane or stick, is extremely psychologically damaging and emotionally and even physically damaging to a child. In a meta-analysis, researchers Elizabeth Gershoff and Andrew Grogan-Kaler from the University of Texas at Austin and the University of Michigan, respectively, evaluated 75 published studies on the relationship between spanking by parents and the various behavioral, emotional, cognitive, and physical outcomes among their kids. Spanking destroys mental health, spanking increases delinquency and criminal behavior, and spanking makes it more likely that the child will be physically abused. And another example is Deuteronomy 22:13 through 21. What these verses basically say is, if a woman is caught not being a virgin on her wedding night, then they are to stone her, okay? That was the biblical law, is that women who aren't virgins on their wedding night have to be stoned. What's interesting here is that there's no law that says if a man's not a virgin on his wedding night, he has to be stoned. This only applies to women. And of course you have the verses about God drowning the entire world. Whether or not you think in Genesis that all the people on earth deserve to be drowned, would you argue that all the unborn children, all the children still in their mothers' wombs, did they deserve to die? And the children that were too young to know any better, they got drowned too. And then, for example, hell, a lot of Christians are very uncomfortable with the idea of hell and torture, the idea of torturing someone for eternity just because they don't believe or accept the message of Christ. So these are just a few examples of the kinds of verses you will find in the Bible and examples of biblical morality. At this point, your intuition should be screaming to you that there's something wrong. Nobody in this room probably thinks that these things are okay, but if you subscribe to a Christian view of morality, then these are things you must be okay with. You have to be. On a Christian view of morality, where God's actions and characters are the standard of goodness, your own moral intuitions about right and wrong are completely irrelevant. It doesn't matter how you feel. It doesn't matter how wrong you think or feel. Any event or genocide in the Bible is, you simply have to accept it as moral. In Buddhism, it's just the opposite. In Buddhism, your moral intuitions are an extremely important part of knowing the difference between right and wrong. If something feels horribly wrong, you should trust that. Oftentimes our moral intuitions will give us insights into the danger or uncertainty of a situation where our rational mind alone cannot. If you read or hear Bible verses like this and you are emotionally disgusted or repulsed, that's a warning sign that you shouldn't just ignore. Our moral intuitions are just as important for understanding the nature of morality as our rational faculties. But the problem gets worse, because in Christianity, even your rational faculties are irrelevant to moral decision making. If God orders you to, say, slay an entire village or hurt somebody you care about, you must do it. And the reason you must do it is because your own feelings and thoughts about what is moral are irrelevant, because God is the standard of morality. So you might say, God would never ask me to do something so horrible that my rational and moral intuitions were so opposed to it. And I would respond, why not? He asked people in the Bible to do those things all the time. He had his people brutally slay the Canaanites and the Amalekites. He asked people to rip the live babies out of pregnant women and by cutting them open and then throwing them against the ground. What makes you think he wouldn't ask you to do something you would disagree with? So the final topic I want to address is this question of subjective versus objective morality, since I know it's something that will come up. I doubt that anybody in this room will deny that our perceptions and beliefs about the world happen through our own subjective lenses and experiences. Though our experiences may be subjective, we take our subjective experiences and we attempt to build an objective model of reality, taking into account all the facts, data, and evidence available to us. For example, if within the context of my subjective experience, the sun has risen every morning, I can build an objective model of reality in which the sun is independent of me and my experience of it, and in which it will continue to rise regardless of my apprehension of it. This is exactly how science works. Science builds models of an objective reality based on the data and evidence available. We have models of the universe using specific gravitational and physical constants which have been perfected over hundreds of years. These models are not perfect. They change over time. Many models we have now replaced outdated models, and many of the models we have now will likely be replaced with better models in the future. The Christian model of objective reality has changed over time as well. Geocentrism was the dominant model of the universe held by the Catholic Church for hundreds of years. In this model, the Earth was the center of the universe, and the sun revolved around the Earth. Well, that was a bad model, and it has since been replaced. Another model of objective reality that Christians worldwide used to have is one in which witches live and thrive among us. This may have been inspired by the Bible verse, which is Exodus 22:18, I suffer not a witch to live. As a result, historians believe hundreds of thousands of innocent women were burned at the stake throughout Europe and North America over the past 1,000 years. Well, we know this model is incorrect now. Most Christians don't believe there are witches among us anymore that need to be killed, but that was the predominant model for a long time. So my point in all this is I'm not suggesting that there isn't an objective reality outside of our own subjective experience. My point is that our best access to it is by taking the evidence and data available to us and coming to a rational conclusion about what that model is. Morality is no exception to this process. When discussing moral systems, we must use our own experiences coupled with the evidence and data available to us to draw the most reasonable conclusion and come up with the best moral system. So, for example, let's discuss the topic of homosexuality. I, as a rational person, can begin by trying to look at homosexuality in as unbiased a way as possible. I can discover that my own experience with homosexuals has been positive. They're normal people, no different than any heterosexual person, except that they're attracted to the same sex, where I'm attracted to the opposite sex. That doesn't seem like a big deal. I can look at science and see that homosexuality is completely normal and natural, having been observed in over 1,500 animal species. I can look at the work of sociology, which finds that homosexuals make just as good of parents and people and do not negatively impact society the way that some Christians tell us they do. In other words, when I take an unbiased look at all of the evidence and data available to me, there's no reason to view homosexuality as wrong when constructing an objective model of reality, of morality. Now let's take the same question of homosexuality on the Christian view. Well, in the Christian view, homosexuality is immoral. Why is it immoral? Well, because the Bible says so. In Leviticus, it labels homosexuality as an abomination and calls for the death of any people engaging in this act. Does it give a reason for why homosexuality is wrong or negative to society? Nope. The people who wrote the Bible just say it offends God. That's the reason you have to accept. Now, I'm sure you can already see the problem with this model of objective morality. It's not based on evidence or data or personal experience with reality. It's based on beliefs and writings of people who lived thousands of years ago who claim to have a connection with the divine. homosexuals today in the 21st century are being condemned and mistreated because of what ancient people believed ages ago. But the Christian model of objective reality is not based on observation, evidence, or data. It is based on God as the standard of morality without question. In the end, you get to choose what model of objective morality you subscribe to. Is it better to use a model in which your own moral intuitions and rational faculties are an important part of the decision-making process? In which, if you have an intuition or think that something is wrong, that is an important way for you to decide if your objective moral model is correct. Or one in which there is an ultimate objective standard which you cannot question, nor do you have to understand, even if this standard seems horrific and reprehensible. On my view, the model which takes the evidence and data into account is the most consistent with how we determine objective truth in every other facet of our lives, making it the better model. Thank you very much. Okay, questions?
Who will you be debating?
Chandler.
Chan.
He's a big William Lane Craig apologist.
I know we've been on this merry-go-round many times, but I still fail to see how moral intuition gets you even part of the way to an objective morality, because moral intuitions, I mean, you can talk about what you think is logical and rational, but ultimately there are so many people that disagree, and not just on big things, but on small things as well. And so you like to use that as a point against the idea of objective morality, because you say, well, if we can't even agree in this room on everything that's right and wrong, right? Even us Christians in the room, we probably have small disagreements here and there about what we think is correct to do in certain situations. So if you think that that's such a good piece of evidence against objective morality, how can you ever hope to promote anything even slightly resembling objective morality if that's kind of what we're left with in moral experiences, opinions of people and everyone disagreeing? And
well, like I said before, I think when we talk about morality, we're talking about models, right? We're talking about models of morality, and even Christians have these models, right? There's a different model that Calvinists have than Molinists have, than Arminians have. So we're talking about a model of reality. We may not ever know if that model is perfect, right? Because the model that we have is based on, say, the evidence and data available to us. That's the point I'm trying to make.
But I don't see how you can even have a coherent model if you're basing your view on evidence and data, and it's just so clearly different on, maybe you can get some big things, because I actually do think that there are some big issues that you do see pretty much universal agreement on, even in different cultures. But with almost no one agreeing on every single issue, how can you say that you're arriving at some even some kind of model? I mean, because your model is different from mine, different from his.
So, okay,
that's not what we mean by model in science.
But in science, that's exactly what happens. You have hundreds or thousands of different models, hundreds of models that compete with each other when describing, say, cosmology, quantum theory, dark matter, right? So you can go, you can say science is an objective. Look at all these models that you have that are disagreeing. It's true. There's a lot of different models in science. They're all looking at the same evidence and data. They're trying to explain the evidence and data in the best way. That's just the best we can do, right?
I would say that if you're just going off of the data, and that's all you got, you're basically, your data set is, okay, person A believes X, person B believes Y. If that is the data that you were trying to explain, and you're trying to put that into a model, how are you ever, you're never going to get anything other than subjective morality out of that from data alone.
Well, I wasn't, in the presentation I just gave, I didn't just say person X believes, A, or person Y believes B. What I said was, if you look at you can rely on your personal experience, you can rely on science, you can rely on sociology. There's a lot of different data and evidence that you can apply to come up with a moral model. Do you see what I'm saying? And another point I'm trying to make is Christians are also doing this. You just have a different model. You're saying in my model, God is the objective standard for morality, and this is the best model. I gave you reasons why I don't think that's a good model. Because your own moral intuitions and rational faculties are completely irrelevant. If God says homosexuality is wrong, it's wrong. It doesn't matter if you understand it. It doesn't matter what you think about it. It doesn't matter what you feel about it. It's completely irrelevant. Because this is the standard in which everything God says and does is good, period.
Right, and you can have that conversation about the Christian model. But what I'm saying is, when you remove transcendent moral anchoring, there is no possible way for you to defend any kind of non-subjective model of morality. Like, you have to have that transcendent anchor there. Now, you can say that even that one fails, but then at the end of the day, if that's successful, all that does is say, okay, well, no model of morality works. It's all subjective. You Christians don't have, you say you can promote this objective view, but ultimately your model fails, so now we're just left in a world of subjectivism.
I mean,
even granting if that is true, there's no way that you can get past the fact that science, and I know you say science does have relevance to it, but science has no relevance to morality as far as I'm concerned. I mean, what could you possibly say from a scientific experiment about how things should work or how things ought to work?
I mean, I think science is very relevant to it, and I'll explain why. So, for example, in the Christian model, people are born inherently sinful or depraved and broken. But like I said, in the Buddhist model, people are born good, right? People are born inherently seeking inner peace and inherently having a good nature. We can look at science to see which one of those is more realistic. We can see that...
but see, you're already using the word good there, like good and evil nature. So then you're saying, how can science could tell us which one of these is true or not? But I thought you were trying to argue that we needed to use science to arrive at our definitions of objective good and objective evil in the first place.
No, I said you can appeal to science. I gave many different things that you can appeal to. Personal experience, moral intuition, science, sociology. My point was, if you look at science, if you look at evolution, it makes perfect sense, right? Because if human beings really were evil, like the Bible says, we're really evil, sinful, depraved, we're just out to get each other, screw each other over at every available opportunity, and we're all just mini Hitlers, waiting to happen, then the human race could not have survived. There's no way, because the process of natural selection is brutal. 99.9% of species that have ever lived are gone. So we have to have this inherent kind of moral instinct, moral intuition, moral, goodness to survive. And also, because here's what I'm saying, that natural moral instinct that we have, which has allowed human beings to survive, right? The things like empathy, love, cooperation, working together for the greater good. I'm not saying that's all there is, right? But even competition can be good, can be moral in the right situation. What I'm saying is, these moral instincts we have are the foundation for what we view as moral, right? Without these, how would we even have any compass for knowing what was moral? Because like I said before, if your compass is just whatever God says and does, then whatever God says and does can be absolutely horrible. It doesn't matter what you think about it. It doesn't matter what you feel about it. If God says, rip these babies out of these women, then you have to do it. It's completely irrelevant. Your intuitions, your thoughts, completely irrelevant.
Well, I think you're just going to fundamentally disagree with the point, because like I said, we've been on this merry-go-round before,
Yeah.
and I really just don't think that if you're saying that moral intuition comes from an evolutionary process, you're not going to get to objective morality that way, or even models of some objective morality out there. You're just saying that this has evolved, and with all the good things that have evolved, there's no way that scientifically you can show that we're all good, because there are lots of things in human beings that you see in the animal kingdom that we know is not good. If you want to talk about homosexuality being in all these species, in most species, sexual copulation is not just a willful, loving act. It's a forceful dominant male rapes the female. And so there are lots of things that we see in human society as well as animals that you can also attribute to evolution. And so while if evolution has happened to give us our sense of morality, then that's the explanation you're left with. So you can't use that as a process to support the Buddhist view that we're born all good. I think if you are using evolution and science to support your view of morality, then you're going to have to grant that there's some good and bad in all of this.
Well, I would say that evolution is a starting point, right? But then we have things like philosophy now. We have things like science. So we take our moral intuitions, our moral instincts, and then we come to kind of a rational idea about what's best for society. Things like Kant's categorical imperative, things like the golden rule. So this is a starting point. I'm not saying that everything that happens in nature is good, right? I'm saying every writing about morality, I don't see how you can disagree with. Every law, every opinion, every belief, every thought that has ever come about morality has come from a human being. Every single one. There has never been a thought or philosophy of morality that has fallen out of the sky. There's never been an idea or law or philosophy of morality that has just appeared,
Assuming Christianity is false, that's true. But,
okay. But what I'm saying is even the Bible was written by people. They may have been people inspired. They can say they are inspired by God, but you cannot get around this fact that morality comes from human beings. Because in every single case, it is always a human being that talks about it, that writes it down, that creates the law, that creates the philosophy. Morality always comes from human beings. Now you can say, well, they were divinely inspired. That's your opinion. You're welcome to believe that. But you cannot escape the fact that morality is intrinsically human. It has to be, because it always comes from humans.
See, you just have to, that has to go back to the question of whether Christianity is true or not, because you can't just assert that. Because
why not? That's the truth.
What you just said is blatantly false if Christianity is true. God is...
No, it's not false. What I said is true. The people that wrote about the morality as defined by the Bible was written by people. That is the truth. It was written by human beings.
Yeah,
now they claim to have
but what you were saying is that we can trace all these moral foundation and every moral thought back to some human mind. But what I'm saying is, if Christianity is true, that is not true, because what human beings write down is not just of themselves. And you said it yourself. If Christianity is true, then a lot of biblical writings claim to be inspired by God, and God uses the human author.
But even if you say it's inspired by God, right? Yeah. Let's say I go to listen to a beautiful concert, right? A symphony, Mozart or Beethoven, and I'm inspired by this. I'm so inspired that I write a poem about how beautiful that concert was. Still, the concert may have inspired me, but it's still coming from a human being. It's still coming from me, not God. If God wanted to write the Bible, he could write his own Bible.
No,
but the point is,
that's
people...
very different. If God says, here, write this moral code down, then human beings have written something down that has absolutely nothing to do with what they think about morality. They are actually submitting to a standard that God has given them. And so, if you're assuming that the Bible is written by men who have been inspired by God, and sometimes that's not just inspired in the sense that you talked about. That's not how Christians use the word inspired. It's not like a musical piece inspiring you. But especially like in the case of the Ten Commandments, Moses brought them down, maybe Moses wrote them down, maybe someone later wrote them down. But that's some kind of ethical moral code that is, the Bible claims has been given by God. Now, like I said, I'm not saying right now that that's true, but what I'm saying is, if you want to have this conversation, you can't just assume that to be false.
Look,
because we're comparing Christianity with Buddhism.
Here's what I'm saying.
Internal consistency.
What you have, that the Bible was inspired by God, that the people writing weren't actually those people. God was moving their hand. He was whispering.
That's not what Christians mean by inspired.
Okay, whatever you mean, that God was somehow inspiring them, telling them what to write, and they somehow wrote it. That is what you have faith to believe. You have faith. You can believe that. You can assert that that's the case. But the reality is that every moral thought, right, everything that is moral has come from human beings. That you can't deny. You can on faith say, well, in this one specific case, it was God moving their hand or whispering into their ear, or whatever you mean by inspired. It's very ambiguous. But you cannot deny that it always comes from humans. And if you accept that it always comes from humans, right?
But if all you mean by it comes from humans is that a human wrote it down, like humans getting an idea from God or getting a moral code from God, if all you mean is it comes from humans, if all you mean by that is that they wrote it down, then your point is completely irrelevant to what you're trying to say, because I thought you were trying to back up the point that all moral systems come from a human source in the sense that we really can't escape there's no objective something because all moral systems have human origination. But
I'm not saying there's no objective something. The point I'm trying to make to you, right, is that the same problems that you have brought up when trying to create an objective moral system, and I agree it's difficult for the same reason that it's difficult to create objective science models of reality, right? Because there's so many different ways you can interpret the data. My point is, these same objectives you bring up concerning morality are objections you can bring up concerning truth, concerning anything. Because when you can construct an objective model, right, you have different methods of doing it. You have different methods, and you have different evidence, and you have different data. So this goes back to the problem of what I brought up in my speech. What we have are subjective human experiences, right? Everything happens within the context of our own subjective lens. I don't think you would disagree with that. What we do then is create an objective model of reality and then say, okay, I think this is the best model based on this evidence, this data. I'll give my reasons why. But what you have, the objections you have brought up about morality are no different than doing it in any other case, right? It's all the same problem. So if you're saying, well, we can't have an objective moral model because of all these issues, then you're saying we can't have an objective model of anything because these are all the same issues that you run into. Anyway, I wanted to ask questions of anyone else. Yeah.
We've had this conversation numerous times. Adam's been with us about 3 years. Anybody else have questions, comments?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, this is my first time being here, and I will probably sound a little dumb, but I just have a question. You say you were a Christian before, right?
Yeah, I was a Christian for most of my,
So, there were people who have you ever read the book Evidence for Real, the little boy who passed away?
Yeah.
Did you believe that before, and you just quit believing it now? Did you believe that he really talked with God and met God and stuff then, and then you stopped believing it when you stopped being a Christian?
I didn't read that book prior to,
in general, did you believe, there's all kinds of people that said they've met God, died, met God, came back to life. Did you believe that then, and then stop believing it now?
Yeah, I mean, back when I was a Christian, I obviously believed in things like miracles, and I believed in things like, heaven, people that have visited God or talked to God. I mean, when I was a Christian, I believed in that, right? But once I left Christianity, I started to reevaluate the beliefs that I had, right? And for a lot of the reasons I've given tonight, I didn't think that it was a rational or moral system, right? I think there's a lot of problems with it. For example, a lot of the verses I bring up, these aren't verses you hear about, right? I mean, when you really look at the Bible, these are really terrible things, but you as a Christian have to accept them as moral. And so there was a lot of things that as a Christian I didn't really know or question. But then the more I learned about Christianity, and especially once I left Christianity, I had a very different opinion of it. Do you see what I'm saying?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so do you feel that selfishness is the origin of suffering in Buddhist religion?
Yes.
Yeah. So if we're inherently good, how can we be selfish?
Selfishness is good in some cases, right? There's two kinds of selfishness. There's Donald Trump selfishness, right? There's selfishness in terms of always putting yourself above others, crapping over other people to get what you want. It's kind of like sociopathy, right? And then there's selfishness in terms of putting your own well-being first, because no one else is going to do it for you. So if you don't take care of yourself, if you don't take care of your health, if you're always putting other people before you at the expense of yourself, you'll die, right? I mean, how can you help anyone else? How can you help anyone else's lives be happy if you're miserable? How can you help anyone else be healthy if you're unhealthy? Right? It's the same reason why they say, when you're on a plane, who's flown before? So when you're on a plane, when they say that the oxygen mask will drop down in an emergency, secure your own mask first before securing the mask of others. Why do they say that? Well, let's say you have a child beside you, and the plane is having turbulence and the oxygen mask drop down. If you're sitting there trying to secure your child's oxygen mask, and then you pass out, you can't help your child. You're passed out, and now they're going to pass out too because they don't have an oxygen mask, and you could both die. So this is just one example of in life how putting yourself first sometimes, and in a way that, for example, securing your own oxygen mask so you can breathe, so you can help your child. There's many times in life that being selfish is good. right? There's selfishness in terms of taking care of yourself because no one else is going to do it. And the reason that taking care of yourself is good is because then once you're happy, once you're healthy, then you can share that with others. This is very much Buddhist, right? Because if you find inner peace, if you find enlightenment, if you have this wonderful experience that you can share with other people, you really have found inner peace, then you can help other people who are suffering. But if you're still suffering, how can you help anyone else, right? I mean, you can help people in a small way, but if you have found enlightenment, if you have found this amazing experience, then even though it was selfish because you had to find it first, now you can share it with other people and hopefully teach them how to do the same thing. Did you have a question?
I was actually fixing my sleeve, but I do have a question
Yeah,
for you.
go ahead.
So my question is, let's entertain the thought that the Christian God did exist for. Just
Okay.
entertain that
Sure.
thought just for a minute. And I just really want to hear what you have to say on this. In the land of Canaan, because you mentioned that.
Yeah, the Canaanites.
They would practice child sacrifice by placing it inside of the statue of Molech and setting the belly on fire while the kid was burning. And, to be really good, like to really worship the God, you defecate on each other and have sex. So my question would be, would God be just in getting rid of them and entering into that land?
No, I don't think so. I don't think genocide is ever okay. I mean, personally, I don't see how genocide is a good moral model. And here's why. Okay, obviously you have a lot of backward cultures, and even today, let's look at the Islamic culture. They generally mutilate females, right? Terrorist attacks. There's extremism. There's hatred of homosexuals. Should we just go wipe those societies? I mean, we could, right? Let's get the nukes. Let's nuke them. Let's nuke Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's just get them off the map. I mean, they're too difficult to deal with. But why don't we do that? No, John agrees.
That would be really funny if someone joined the live stream just at that moment, just for you to hear that. I was like, all right, I'm done.
Yeah, I want you to take me out of context. I'm giving you permission. I want this to be a soundbite on Fox News. So that'll be my 10 seconds of fame. But
you can't be a politician anymore.
No. Oh, thank God. It's a gift. But
Wall Street Journal's gonna get on from above.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I don't even think in those cases it's the right thing to do. I think we can teach. I mean, I think we can influence those cultures and hopefully get to a point where, they don't believe that female genital mutilation is okay. That they're not so extremist. I mean, I think the westernization of those cultures is already happening. It may be slow, but I think over time those cultures, through their interaction with us and through the fact that we are in many ways very generous and understanding of those cultures, though not always, but I think like with the refugees, the way that the Western world takes in refugees and tries to be understanding, not in every case, but within reason. I think we are already influencing those cultures for the better. I don't think wiping them off the map would be okay. I mean, you could make that argument that we should wipe them off the map. I just think that would be pretty messed up.
Are you insinuating to send all the feminists to the Middle East?
Please. Please. Give them something to do.
I don't know how relevant this is, especially with Buddhism. I looked into it a little bit too, and I first, I guess, covered myself in it just because I'm growing my horizons. And a lot of, like, for example, if you want to keep comparing Christianity and Buddhism, I guess, in little bits, like, I know Christianity, in general, condemns female sexuality altogether, especially female sexuality, or even, it tells you specifically what to exactly to do or what not to do. I guess other than, because I know Buddhism is about looking, like Christianity is about finding answers from an outside source.
Yeah.
Buddhism more or less is finding from inside.
Right.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is there anything else notable, just off the top of your head, like something like that, to compare it? Like, does Buddhism have anything to say about expressing sexuality, expressing art?
It has like the 5 precepts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is like, do not engage in acts of killing. Do not engage in acts of sexual misconduct, right? Mm-hmm. Don't steal. But here's the thing, like, notice how these are kind kind of ambiguously labeled, right? Because, again, like you said, Buddhism appeals to a person's own moral intuition as a source for knowing the difference between right and wrong. So when you say things like, do not engage in sexual misconduct, yes, it includes things like rape. It includes things like cheating on your spouse or whatever. But it's left to the practitioner to decide. Because if you try to, I don't know, the problem is that you cannot write out every situation, right? That's the issue. If you say lying is always wrong, as it does the Ten Commandments, it's always wrong to bear false witness, then you get in this situation where you're hiding an innocent family of Jewish people under your stairs, and the Nazi soldiers come to your door, and they say, "Are you hiding a Jewish family in your house?" And you have to say yes, because lying is always wrong. It's always wrong to bear false witness. Well, the problem is that now you are taking away the context of the situation. This is why moral rules are better. Moral guidelines are better when they might say killing is wrong, right? Or they might say sexual misconduct or lying, but that ultimately it depends on the situation and it depends on you to be able to apply your own rational and moral intellect. And personally, I feel that's better than just saying this is wrong all the time, this is wrong no matter the situation, it doesn't matter how you feel, it doesn't matter what you think. If God commands you to do it, then it's wrong. Then you have to do it. Homosexuality is wrong because it says it's wrong. To me, how can you say that's a moral system? I mean, you can't. I mean, if you're being reasonable about it, you cannot say that a system based on in which your own beliefs and moral intuitions and rational faculties are completely irrelevant. You cannot say that is a moral system. Go ahead.
But even in culture, there are people like, what you believe, if you believe like setting people on fire because that's what your culture is like moral.
Right.
And that's what you do. To say that like what's moral or what's right and wrong is like individual, each person, you can't have a set idea of what's right and what's wrong.
What I'm saying is we create moral models. That's what I'm trying to say. So for example, for the moral model for most of the world, the model is, including Christianity, in the Christian model, it would be wrong to set people on fire, unless they're witches, in which case it's okay to do that. But if they're not witches, right, for most models, it's wrong to do that. And you can give a lot of reasons, a lot of rational reasons, and I think for the intuition of most people that would be wrong. So what I'm saying is you can create a moral model of the world, right? In which you come up with good reasons and explanations, and you can point to things like science and philosophy and sociology to back up your reasons. What you're saying, it seems like what you're saying is, well, you can disagree with that model. Sure you can, right? But if there is an objective reality and objective truth, then it doesn't matter whether people agree or disagree about it, right? If there is an objective moral reality outside of ourselves, then it doesn't matter what people believe. And the point of the model is to get as close to that reality as we can. Do you see what I'm saying? Go ahead.
Did you say that in Buddhism you can achieve enlightenment?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Well, that's an important. I'm surprised no one's asked that.
I was actually.
Oh, you're going to ask that question?
Yeah.
Okay. So the idea in Buddhism is that people suffer. I mean, suffering is essentially a part of reality, right? Mm. But within the context of, for say, human beings, the reason we suffer is because of this idea of the self. Okay. So I'll give an example. I had a friend post something on Facebook last night, and she said, I have this problem with hyperfixation. She said, I want to be completely immersed within what I'm doing. And then But what I realized is everyone wants to be like that, right? Everyone wants to be completely immersed in what they're doing. When you're watching a movie, when you're playing a game, when you're eating food, when you're having sex, whatever it is, you want to be immersed in it. You don't want to be thinking about all the shit you have to do and all the mistakes you made in the past. I mean, this idea of being completely immersed in something is like the most wonderful experience of life. Why is that? It's because when you are completely immersed in something, the self disappears. There's no self. When you're listening to a beautiful symphony, there's just the music. There's, when you're watching a great movie, there's just the movie. There is no you. The you disappears. So what happens when the you comes back? All the problems come back. When you stop being immersed in whatever it is you're doing, suddenly it's, oh shit, now I have to go to work tomorrow. I have to do all this homework. I'm so stupid. I did this. I did that. Why is this way? Why is this way? I. You cannot suffer without emotionally, right? I'm not saying pain. Obviously, someone can still hit you. But emotionally, you can only suffer when the I is present, right? If it's because I did something wrong. I'm horrible. I have all these things that I have to worry about. I whatever. And what Buddhism teaches through things like mindfulness and meditation is how to remove the I from your experience so that you can be completely immersed in life. And you can, what I'm saying, it's not that it disappears forever. I mean, you can have that, you can view the world from that way. But what I'm saying is we're stuck in that way right now. The I is an integral part of everything we do, and we're desperately trying to escape it because it's annoying, right? It's annoying. No one wants to think about what you have to do tomorrow and all the mistakes you made in the past, and does my girlfriend hate me now, and am I ever going to be good enough, and all these things. When you get rid of that and you simply become immersed in your experience, and when you have the ability to do that kind of at will whenever you want, that's enlightenment. You have found inner peace.
Has anyone ever achieved that?
Yeah. I mean,
have you done it?
No.
Like float?
No.
Yeah. We're running real close on time.
Okay.
Is there any? I know Isaac has a question we may have to do after we cut the live feed. But anybody else have a question? Comment? Lee had one also, but we're pushing almost an hour, so.
Come on, let me do it.
You can go ahead.
All right, we'll let you do it.
This is more. We won't have time to go like.
Into detail.
This would be like a debate in itself, but just for future reference.
I want to debate you one day, Isaac. Come on.
Especially for like when you're debating Chan, there are a few things that I think you can argue that a consistent Christian model should be as you said, but I will go ahead and warn you that Christians will not make this characterization of their own model. So, first of all, I don't think you made the comment that if God's character is the standard of morality, then theoretically we should be able to replicate that, and therefore that would be perfect morality. Mm-hmm. But Christians actually don't agree with that premise. They believe that there are certain things that God has, rights that God has as creator, or certain things that God knows because of how he's orchestrating things, that it is okay for God to do, that it is not necessarily for us to take the authority on ourselves to do. So it's not true that what God does is always okay for us to do. The second one... I agree. The point is, I agree with that. What I was pointing out is the problem with that. Right, because that's fine. That's fine. Yeah. So the second thing would be that, and you briefly mentioned this too, if you're going to argue that God's punishment of sinners through genocide or whatever is just not a viable moral model. Essentially what you have to do is argue against the moral philosophy that, or even I guess maybe it's almost a political philosophy, that it is not okay to like punish evil or to punish sin. So if you disagree with that, that's fine, but just realize from a Christian point of view, that is a viable political philosophy, moral philosophy. Punishment of sin is something that is actually just and a good thing. Third, when you quote some of those verses from the Old Testament, make sure you look through verses. There are some verses that may still be on the surface problematic, right. But there are some of those verses where God is simply describing things, and that doesn't mean that he's necessarily giving approval or commanding it. So like when God is describing, this is what's going to happen to you, your babies are going to be ripped out, like that's not actually God commanding soldiers to go in and listen, this is how I want you to do it. I want you to go in, I want you to stab people, and I want you to make sure to cut out all the babies from the women. He's just describing a consequence that's going to happen to people. And so with a Christian view of God's foreknowledge, that does not necessarily mean that God's command is actively in that. And then fourthly, make sure when you're pulling some of those verses from the first 5 books of the Bible, that you be careful what moral applications you make from that, because as Christians, we actually do not believe that the first 5 books of the Bible are a perfect reflection of God's moral code. That's interesting. When you get to Jesus in the New Testament, there's a question about divorce, and Jesus' answer is, listen, the only reason that Moses allowed divorce in the first place was because of your hardness of heart. From the beginning, it wasn't always like this. So in other words, God's standards were set up for perfection in Genesis 1 and 2. However, when you get to the Old Testament law, there are some parts of that that accurately reflect God's moral character, but some of it was not a reflection of God's perfect character. Some of it was actually God giving commandments for Israel at a certain time and place, and it was a reflection of him making, even, you might even say, compromises because of their hardness of heart. So don't assume that anything you read in the Law of Moses is a perfect reflection of the perfect moral law of God.
Okay, let me just respond one thing to that, and then we can end, and we can talk more after. But what specifically one of those points, because you brought up 5, but I think it was the second one in which he said, to Christians, things like genocide might be just; they might be a form of justice. The point I was trying to bring up is that when I bring up these verses, when I talk about things like genocide, like drowning the entire world or wiping out the Amalekites or the Canaanites, my point was that for most people, you're going to have this repulsive moral intuition that says this is horrible. I mean, it's terrible to just genocide people because they disobey you or whatever. And my point was addressing the audience is that in Buddhism, these moral intuitions are important, right? So if you have a problem with genocide, the kind of verses I'm reading are repulsive to you, that's something that you should consider. That's something that is important. Because if you look at the Buddhist texts, if you look at the things the Buddha said, there's nothing in there that I think you could look at and you'd be like, oh my God, this is horrible. There's no slavery, there's no genocide, there's no torture. You know, Buddha basically said, here's one thing he says. He says, if you are being hacked in half by a saw, so you have 2 marauders one on each side of you, hacking you in half with a saw, and you feel anger for one moment, then you have not heard my teachings, right? So the point is, you do not have this same kind of problem in Buddhism where you have to make and excuse all kinds of terrible atrocities and things, and come up with reasons why it's okay that you do in Buddhism. And I guess that was the main point I was trying to make with that. But anyway.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll continue this when we cut the feed, if you so desire. I've got all the time that you all need, and Adam doesn't care, I'm sure. Thank you for watching online. If you did watch, if not, you can see the recording at a later time. Will you hit pause?
Finish.
Stop, or whatever. Finish will work.
You gotta clear off the low battery.
Might help charge your phone for 7
I was at 90% when I got here. So.
Oh my goodness.